Good evening. My name is John Richardson. Tonight is June 30th, 2014, and welcome to Independent Nation. Independent Nation is a show designed to consider, explore the state of democracy in Canada, the Westminster model, independent candidates, and of course the Toronto elections, which will be coming up. And I suppose I should begin. I understand that Mayor Ford has returned today by welcoming Mayor Ford back to Toronto. But that said, I'd say at the outset, normally this show is run by Mr. Bauman Yazdanfar and me. Tonight, Mr. Yazdanfar is not with us. He will be back next show. So, June 30th, 2014 doesn't mean a lot to some people. Tomorrow's Canada Day. But it is the night before, the final night before FATCA, the United States Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, takes effect in Canada tomorrow. And this has huge implications for issues of democracy and freedom and sovereignty in Canada. And I'd like to begin by introducing our two guests this evening who have actually been here before. We've talked about the role of citizenship. We have here Trish Moon, who will be here as a concerned Canadian, who is a former United States citizen and somebody who's been concerned with the question of FATCA in Canada since its inception. And along with her, welcome back to Peter Dunn, who's the guiding force, the spirit, if you will, of the Isaac Brock Society, which has been an organization that's played a very, very important role in teaching about FATCA, awareness, organizing opposition to it. But I think we need to begin with a very simple question. I'll start with Trish. Trish, what is this FATCA thing anyway?
Well, it's a U.S. law that they are imposing on every nation on Earth, that all foreign financial institutions have to report who their American clients are in a so-called attempt to collect taxes. And
So-called. Why do you say so-called?
I'm not aware of any provisions in the actual legislation that determine that it could be collected, and I'm also don't think that's even possible because we have the revenue rule in Canada.
Well, hold on. I mean, who are they hunting for? Who's the U.S. hunting for? They want all citizens of the world to pay them taxes? Or
No, they want
for?
American citizens. They want what they call U.S. persons.
What would that be?
Well, a green card holder, somebody that may not be actively using that anymore but didn't bother to do the whole process and cancel
So let me get this straight. You're saying that they are requiring somebody who had a green card who no longer lives in the United States to pay taxes to the United States?
As long as they've something about 8 years out of the last 15. There's a time frame to it. I'm sorry, I don't remember the exact threshold. But it also affects people like if you're married, if you're a Canadian married to a dual, and let's say the wife is a stay-at-home mom, all the money that's earned by the husband, since the wife's name is on, they consider him basically a U.S. person, and he's required to report his accounts, and the banks will look at that and report it. So Canadians who have nothing to do with the United States will be affected by this.
You're telling me that just any part of any family, any contact with one of these so-called U.S. persons would subject you to U.S. taxation?
Well, the family, it would affect your family, of course. And there are people who haven't been Americans for decades. They came here prior to the mid-'80s, and they were told in no uncertain terms that they had lost their American citizenship by becoming Canadian. And the Supreme Court changed the ruling on that, said you had to intend, and so people are being scared to death that they are, all of a sudden, they're Americans again, when they've been Canadians for 30, 40 years.
You say scared to death. I gather that being an American is not a desirable thing these days.
Not according to some of us, no.
Other kinds of U.S. persons, Peter?
Other kinds?
Other kinds? We have green card holders.
Anyone who was born in the United States would be considered a U.S. person under FATCA. So let's suppose you lived in a border town in Canada and your parents took you when your mother was pregnant she went to a hospital in the United States across the border and you were born in that hospital, you would be a United States citizen according to U.S. law. And so you may have spent your entire life in Canada, you may have worked here exclusively, you would still be indicated by this new law.
So this sounds like it's largely just a place of birth issue.
Well, in the case of many of these people that I've talked to them personally, they were born in the United States, and sometime during their childhood they moved back to Canada with their Canadian parents. In many cases the parents are Canadian, and the United States wants their banking account information.
You know, it's funny, I was trying to explain this to somebody last week, and she said to me, "You've got to be kidding. That's unjust. It's inhumane. I had no choice where I was born."
Well, exactly, it's unjust because it amounts to what in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which I had to learn about in order to become a Canadian citizen. It says that in Canada you cannot discriminate against people because of their national origin. So starting tomorrow, of course the banks are closed fortunately,
They're
banks,
taking the day off to get their U.S. detection systems in order, I guess.
Right.
Right?
Starting tomorrow, the banks will begin to systematically ask their new clients if they're an American citizen or not.
Have you ever been an American citizen?
Or if they were born in the United States. These sort of questions. And they might mask it with a question like, can you please tell us all your citizenships? So it looks like they're trying to be, all-inclusive, but they're really going to be looking for U.S. persons, U.S. citizens, people born in the United States.
Interesting. This coincides, of course, at a time when the government is amending the Citizenship Act to essentially single out different, to sort of partition citizens into different groups.
Yeah, if you're a dual citizen, and you may find that you won't be a citizen anymore if the government decides that they don't like you. I mean, that's the way I understand.
As I understand it, the conservative government doesn't like anybody.
Well,
who will be left? They have to leave enough people to vote for them.
Yeah, but they'll, if you decrease the pool of voters, then that.
That's true. That's true.
Yeah.
But all this, obvious unfairness aside, I was telling this to my brother about a year ago, and he looked at me in total disbelief, and he said, "You got to be kidding. Why would Canada or any other country go along with this?"
Because they are extorting. The United States has said if the banks or financial institutions don't comply by doing this, they will withhold. It's actually not withholding, it's a real tax. They won't get it back, 30% of the U.S. sourced funds that the institution gets, not the persons that are involved. Like, let's say they wanted to report me and I had $3,000. It wouldn't be 30% of the $3,000. It would
just everything, absolutely everything
of what they've got.
In other words, if these banks don't agree as a general principle to root out those U.S. persons,
right,
and send them these reports, they're going to deduct that 30%, are they?
That's what they've said, and that's outrageous considering Canada. I mean, we are their biggest trading partner. 80% of the trade between the two countries. We already have an information sharing agreement with them via the treaty, and there's no need for them to know deposits and withdrawals. I mean, this is stuff that the banks were not even allowed to give the CRA prior to the signing of the IGA.
Well, hang on now. So this IGA thing, as I understand this is an intergovernmental agreement that essentially, with the support of the Canadian banks, the government of Canada simply made a decision to say, well, we think that we're going to help the U.S. with this FATCA thing, so we're going to enter into an agreement with them specifically. And as part of that agreement, we in fact are going to change our Canadian laws that prohibit discrimination and guarantee privacy and things like that to make them compatible with this U.S. demand. That's my understanding of it. Is that your understanding?
That's exactly what they did.
So in other words, what the government of Canada has done, I mean, I don't see any other way of viewing it, is they have simply signed an agreement with the United States to basically turn over a good part of Canadian sovereignty to the United States. Is that your interpretation?
Absolutely. They've also done it with the border. I mean, Harper, the whole government has just gone crazy, and there will be 3, I'm aware of now, 3 lawsuits brought on issues about constitutionality that the government is the Citizenship Act, the Fair Elections Act, and now FATCA will all be challenged on a constitutional basis.
Well, as I understand it, the Harper government has been losing a lot of constitutional challenges in the Supreme Court of Canada. In fact, they've been losing so many that I wonder if the way to argue the case might be, this is legislation coming from the Harper government, but there are other reasons why it's unconstitutional as well.
3 or 4 at least.
3 or 4 at least, and they continue to come. And as I think well known, and Trish perhaps can comment on this, my understanding is in fact that there will be a lawsuit brought to prevent the government of Canada from, or rather to try to undo their entering into this agreement and implementing these laws to assist the United States with its hunt for U.S. citizens.
Right. There's a group called the Alliance for the Defense of Canadian Sovereignty.
And you're part of that group.
I am. I'm on the board. I'm the secretary treasurer, and there are 3 other individuals. And prior to the formation of the nonprofit, we managed to collect enough money to get a legal opinion from Joe Arvey as to whether we had grounds.
The constitutional law lawyer in Victoria,
BC.
British Columbia,
Yeah,
Joseph
out in
Arvey,
BC.
yes.
And we were able to raise that money in less than a week, which that's kind of says a lot when it's just a bunch of little people doing it. And apparently, I'm not a lawyer and I haven't read the opinion, but I've been told that it's very solid and that we have grounds to do it, and we will proceed with the lawsuit.
Well, it's pretty hard to see how this is not discrimination after all. I mean, if the directive is that we want you to hunt for a specific group of people based on where they were born, and that's basically it. I mean, that would seem to me to be not only discrimination, but intentional discrimination. Would you agree with that, Peter?
Well, yes. And I'd like to get back to this question of sovereignty. My understanding of why we have governments is to protect the citizens of the country. Would you agree with that? I mean, one of the main reasons.
I think I would agree with it.
Yeah.
I would agree with it. I mean, I think there's even a logically prior question, why do we have countries at all? I mean, the concept of a country is only a couple hundred years old, I think, isn't it?
Well, I think one of the reasons, before that there were kings, right? Or strongmen, or, people who ran...
Thugs.
Yes. People ran gangs.
Right.
And so it's just basically bigger gangs is what we have. But the reason why people would rally behind a king is because they wanted protection from potential enemies or real enemies that were at their borders. And so if we are in a situation where the government of Canada says, okay, we're not going to protect these people because this country over here has passed a law that says that these people have to pay taxes to us, then the government of Canada has given up its sovereignty. It has essentially lost its first mandate, or I should say abdicated from its first mandate, which is to protect the citizens of the country. And when we talk about the Article 15 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, it says that every person in the country, no matter what their race, no matter what their national origin is deserving of equal protection.
Yep.
And what does that mean? That means that it's quite obvious that this omnibus law implementing FATCA in Canada is a violation of the sovereignty of Canada. It's a violation of Canada's right to protect all of her citizens.
Well, perhaps I could extend that a bit. I mean, I absolutely agree with you. But perhaps you could separate it into 2 issues. I mean, A, it would seem to be a violation of Canadian sovereignty, but it's also a clear breach of the duty of the government of Canada to protect its citizens. I mean, they're actually separate ideas. In this case, the effect of the violation of the sovereignty is to violate the rights of citizens. But both these things are going on. Violation of sovereignty, result of that, essentially carving out a specific group of citizens. I mean, I've actually read things suggesting that during the discussions in the House Finance Committee in May, talking about this omnibus bill, that there were suggestions that Canadian citizens who hadn't been born in the U.S. were actually the equivalent of U.S. taxable property being stored in Canada.
Oh, that's an interesting idea. How does that square up, in your opinion, with Canadian citizenship laws?
Well, I don't think it's necessarily inconsistent with Canadian citizenship laws as they stand, because I mean, not being an expert in the area of Canadian citizenship, but I think that the Canadian citizenship laws describe primarily how you become a citizen.
So then we're really looking at the international laws of citizenship, and in that case, then we have the master nationality rule, which says that a country has right to consider a citizen of that country as exclusively her own citizens. Okay. So it doesn't matter if you're a citizen of UK or a citizen of the United States. If you're a citizen of Canada, living in Canada, Canada has the absolute right under international law to consider you Canadian only. And it doesn't matter what UK says, and it doesn't matter what the United States says. You have a right to protection under Canadian law.
You know, I think that makes a lot of practical sense. I mean, I don't see how the world could operate otherwise.
Well, there's a reason why it works for other people and it doesn't work here, because other countries tax on residency, just like the master nationality rule. Basically, you know, it just makes sense. You live there, that's where you pay your tax. But the Americans do it by citizenship. So no matter where you go, they think they own you. And they've also, in the treaty, they've underwritten what's in the treaty. They've said, well, we can change it at any time. The government just said, oh, okay, let's roll right over and let them do it.
Well, leaving aside the technicalities of that, which is probably true, but once we get into any discussion of treaties, it gets enormously complicated, and you know, I may blow a brain cell or something trying to figure that out. But
just one.
Just one. Well, no, tonight maybe more than one. But I think what is interesting here is, you know, your comment. I thought I just heard you say that U.S. citizens were property.
Well, how else would you look at it? It's supposed to be the freest country on earth. I mean, I grew up there. I didn't leave till I was 27. I couldn't even imagine that the government would think of me as their property. But once they told us, hey, we're going to come after you and you're going to pay $10,000 per account per year for something you didn't report, that they took no responsibility for telling you, and it was a law that really wasn't designed for that in the first place, how else would you look at it?
Well, leaving aside the specifics, I mean, let's break it down at an even more simplistic level. So, by using this concept of what they call citizenship-based taxation, which I have always said I think is very misleading because it makes it seem like it's so patriotic. It really is simply place of birth taxation, you know, unless you renounce on that. But in a world which presumably has to at least do more than pay lip service to international human rights, how can citizens be considered to be property? Or to put another way, how can a country take the position that it can govern the conduct of its citizens outside the country? I mean, this isn't the only area. There's also the Corrupt Foreign Practices Act that would prohibit U.S. citizens from doing business, for example, or conducting certain activities in various parts of the world. A very interesting example of that would have been Bobby Fischer, who in 1994, I believe, wanted to defend his, belatedly of course, but wanted to defend his world chess championship. And essentially the U.S. government said to him, well, no, you know, you can't play chess in Serbia. I mean...
In Serbia?
In Belgrade.
Really?
Absolutely, absolutely. And that led, by the way, to his renunciation of U.S. citizenship and his living out his years in Iceland. But, you know, let's stay on this theme for a second of, you know, of what does it mean to be a citizen? I mean, we are in the midst of Canada changing its citizenship laws. The UK is changing its citizenship laws. The United States is clearly changing its attitude towards its citizens. I mean, do you believe that the idea of being able to control the conduct of a citizen outside the borders, outside its borders in another country, is consistent with international human rights law? Peter?
Well, I haven't given much thought to that.
Well, think about it.
But I would say this: if that person decides to change their citizenship, okay, so you move from the United States to Canada or whatever the nation is, and then you become a citizen of that country, well then, I mean, obviously you have the right to live in that country according to the laws of that country. So in a sense, the problem would then lie from an international rights issue, is that there is the international right you have the right to change your citizenship. Everyone can change their citizenship. So if the United States says, well, you can become a Canadian, but we're still going to tax you, then I would say that is indeed a violation of the right to leave the country.
What about a prohibition on visiting Cuba? You live in Canada, you're a dual Canada-U.S. citizen. I recently read President Carter's book on our endangered moral values. He comments about a former service person in Iraq, an American soldier, came back, was unable to get a visa to visit his family in Cuba. President Carter comments, "It's troubling that the citizen of any other nation could have visited his family in Cuba, yet as an American he cannot." I mean, it seems to me that this issue, you talk about citizens being property, and somehow or other that's related to taxation. But I mean, isn't it sort of a logically prior question? To what extent can a country take the position that it control the activities of its citizens outside the borders?
Well, in the case of Cuba, one could argue that the United States is at war with Cuba.
Since the 1960s?
There was an old song, I think it was the late 60s, called "Indiana Wants Me." You remember that song?
Indiana Wants Me.
Right. Great song. I used to love that song. I think what it was about, though, was somebody who had committed a crime in Indiana,
Right.
had left Indiana,
Right.
and was unhappy about not being able to return to Indiana. Am I right on that?
Oh, I thought he was in jail somewhere else. And
Well, maybe I have it wrong, but let's look at this on a state level. So let's say we have the states of New York and Massachusetts, which are beside each other. Let's say that New York has a law prohibiting the consumption of Coca-Cola. Let's say that Massachusetts has a law requiring the consumption of Coca-Cola. Now, can somebody who's a resident of the state of New York be prosecuted for driving across the border to Massachusetts and having Coke on the basis that this is essentially, because historically, right, people were citizens of states. This is a citizen, a domiciliary of New York, if you will. Can the state of New York prohibit that person from having a Coke in Massachusetts?
well, of course not.
Okay, then
Well,
how can then?
And the other, perhaps more pertinent issue is they can't tax the person for the Coke he drank in Massachusetts.
Exactly.
Now, actually, Peter, on that I'm not quite as sure. Okay.
Oh,
Well, as
I
long-
think it's true.
No,
I think it
not.
probably is true, but okay. So you would agree, I think, that on a state-to-state level that would be impermissible. So
Yeah.
where then can a country get the right? I mean, certainly in the case of New York or Massachusetts, I mean, at least they're cousins, right? I mean, they're related. They're part of the United States, right?
The United States, the United Nations Declaration of Universal Human Rights says that every person has the right to leave their country.
Now,
as
did
far
you
as I
know that you're
know-
required? Well, that is true. But as a U.S. citizen, not only are you required to enter the United States on a U.S. passport, but you're actually required to leave the United States on a U.S. passport.
Oh,
Well, I
I
think to a
didn't know
large
that.
degree the passport requirement is a violation of mobility rights, because if you don't have the passport, then you can't enter back into the country. Well, in some cases, if you could prove you were a citizen, you might be able to get back into the country. But it's controlled so that you wouldn't be, let's say you were leaving Europe and you tried to get onto an airplane without your Canadian passport. You wouldn't be allowed on the airplane. So it's a controlled situation. And so the passport laws actually violate a person's mobility rights. If a person has a right, according to the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, to be able to leave his country and return to his country or her country, then the requirement of a passport is a violation of that right. Now, I mean, a lot of Americans think it's, even Canadians as far as I know, think it's wrong that you should have to show identification when you go to vote. I mean, if you're exercising a fundamental right, then who is the government to put controls on that and say you can't do this fundamental right?
Well,
except under our supervision.
Well, you make a very, very interesting point, because I mean, one could say, well, what's the big deal? You have to show a passport. But of course, the problem is that you can only get a passport with the permission of the government.
Exactly, and they could withhold it for any number of reasons. At the present time, the United States is withholding passports to people who owe money on alimony.
Well, and it said they're going to do it for taxes.
And if you owe over $50,000 of taxes, they have proposed that you can't get a passport, meaning that you are a tax slave and you cannot leave the United States.
Well, it's certainly getting harder and harder to leave the United States. And
I'm glad we're out.
Little doubt about that. I mean, it reminds me a little bit of, when Ron Paul was seeking the nomination for the Republicans. And at one of the debates, he was, there was some discussion about building a wall, at the southern border of the United States. And, he said, well, the wall can be used to keep people in as well.
Yeah, exactly.
And, certainly these...
Well, the Berlin Wall was used to keep people in on the East German side.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And so many of the financial rules that the United States are creating are actually financial Berlin walls.
I think FATCA has been, it's been referred to as the neutron bomb of the financial system, but I think I've also seen it referred to as the equivalent of a Berlin Wall.
Yep.
Yeah, it's basically trying to trap capital in the United States.
Yeah.
But I think we should get back to the issue of the loss of democracy and representation.
Yeah,
in
absolutely,
Canada.
absolutely.
There's this burning issue in my heart. One of the questions you asked earlier was, why did the Canadian government give in to FATCA?
Mm-hmm.
And the reason had something to do with these withholding payments. But these withholding payments aside, we have to understand that it was because the banks lobbied the Canadian government, because the Canadian banks were in between a rock and a hard place. If they didn't make agreements with the United States government in violation of Canadian privacy laws, in violation of Canadian charter rights, then they would be in a situation where they would be experiencing these 30% withholdings if they didn't give in to the United States. If they gave in to the United States,
if they did, they would be in violation of Canadian privacy laws and discrimination laws. So no matter what they did,
whatever they did, they would be in trouble. So basically, the Canadian banks then lobbied the current government of Canada to implement the intergovernmental agreement. Now, one of the questions that we were asked, I asked you before the show started was, do you know of any grassroots lobbying effort by Canadians, constituents of the various members of Parliament, that were saying, we want FATCA. You need to implement FATCA because this is going to be good for Canada. We want this. I mean, do you know?
I can't say that I do.
I've never actually met a person who said, just a private citizen who said, FATCA is wonderful, and we need FATCA.
Of course, if you ask them the question at all, they'd simply say, "What's FATCA?"
Yeah.
Well, what's FATCA?
Right.
Well,
which is, I think, part of the problem.
So this basically explains that we never did have a grassroots movement because nobody knows what FATCA is. Now,
well, there has been, now in fairness though, there has been some, and certainly, the Isaac Brock Society and some of the, a number of other blogs have been, very, very active in lobbying the governments on FATCA issues.
Because the people of the Isaac Brock Society are people with this U.S. citizenship problem. And thanks to the Canadian media, they were made aware of their filing requirements.
Yeah, Canadian media.
Vis-a-vis U.S. law. But then they heard that coming down the pike was this FATCA, and which means that you can't hide your bank accounts anymore. I mean, what?
We weren't hiding our bank
accounts. What the heck?
accounts.
You mean I can't hide my Canadian banking account from the IRS?
Peter, you've got to understand, okay, that your TD bank account or whatever you have down the street from you is, from the U.S. perspective, A, foreign, and B, offshore, for which you should be severely punished.
Well, anyway, to get back to my story, the banks in Canada had no choice, because one of the things that they did after 2008 is they bought up billions of dollars of of U.S. banking assets. Mm-hmm. So they're deeply invested in the United States. And if this 30% withholding thing came into effect, their own investments would be jeopardized. And not only that, but they have invested in the United States deeply with the money of their clients. The retirement accounts that people mm-hmm. have, and they've invested in mutual funds with U.S. assets and so forth. And so the banks were scared to death that FATCA would be implemented.
But
and they would have to pay these 30% withholding. So they lobbied the Canadian government to put this into effect.
All right, just hit the pause button on that for 1 second, then continuing, the sort of the democracy issue that you're raising. But one of the things that's always struck me about this is that the whole discussion has been much more focused on what will the sanction be, what will the penalty be if the banks don't go along with FATCA. And I think that the better question, or at least an equally important question, is what will the penalty be if we do go along with FATCA? And I think that now we see, since they've gone along with FATCA, the penalty actually is it's at the cost of the sovereignty of the country.
Yeah, exactly.
I kid you not. If you look at the legislation, the omnibus bill, that is Part 5 of Bill C-31, there's actually a provision in there that goes so far as to say that any Canadian law inconsistent mm-hmm. with FATCA is void to the extent of the inconsistency. So in other words, on the one hand, a majority government has great latitude. On the other hand, no government has the right to enter into an agreement or pass a law which essentially delegates lawmaking, if you will, or sovereignty to another country, which is exactly what they've done.
Well, and the effect of that is to destroy representative government in Canada. Because I can tell you that I contacted my member of parliament. I know lots of people who contacted their members of parliament to say, we don't want FATCA. FATCA scares us. FATCA is going to cause discrimination against us. Please do not support FATCA. And the members of the government, of the majority, the conservative government, then responded with talking points that were coming from the head. Okay, so the talking points were, it's almost as if you're talking to an idiot when you're.
Well, you are talking. Remember the great Mark Twain line? If I were a congressman, or if I were an idiot, but wait, I repeat myself.
Exactly. The problem is they respond to your very serious questions with talking points that are coming from their head, and that's the head of the party. And I would imagine that's Stephen Harper, right? And so, in a sense, I no longer have a representative in Parliament because the representative now represents the interests of the banks.
Well, actually, I don't think. I agree with you. I agree with you in a general sense. But the reason you don't have a representative in Parliament is because of how the parties themselves have sort of corrupted the idea of a Westminster democracy over the years. In the early years, there's nothing at all in the early years that suggest there should be political parties, and they simply began as voting coalitions. And now what has happened is that they are so deeply entrenched that the loyalty of the MP is actually to the party and not to the constituent.
Exactly, and this is what the biggest threat to Canadian sovereignty is, the fact that the people who created the government in the first place don't have any kind of representation in government anymore.
That's right.
And so then the Prime Minister and his minions seem to think that there's nothing wrong with handing over financial account information of Canadian citizens to a foreign government.
Well, no, just the Prime Minister. Just the Prime Minister. Remember, the rest of them don't think at all.
All right. Well, I call them minions.
Well, I wouldn't even call them that. I mean, I would just simply call them the mechanism on the ballot to vote for
Mr. Harper.
For Mr. Harper. I mean, it's a terrible problem, and I'm really sorry we don't have Bauman with us here tonight because he's worked very, very hard to get independent candidates on the map, and in fact has created, provincially, the Canadians' Choice Party, which actually is, in fact, a party for independent candidates, meaning it's sort of a marketing and philosophical coalition. But this is exactly the problem. That sure, we can look at this specific group of people, who are clearly being discriminated against. But the point is that no Canadian has any representative in Parliament anymore. None. Zero. Save and except the few independent MPs out there.
Well, this is something new to me. I didn't realize this until we got involved in this. So we started the Isaac Brock Society in 2011, and people started spontaneously writing their MPs. And most of the time, they didn't get any kind of response at all. And when they did get a response, it was just like the same letter over and over and over again from Jim Flaherty, saying, "Well, we're fighting for you, we're working for you, we're opposed to this." But then I don't know, something happened along the way. We thought that Flaherty was doing a pretty good job of protecting Canada, and then all of a sudden, they were going to sign this IGA, the Intergovernmental
I don't
Agreement.
think they did very much at all. He was supposed to put an ad in the newspapers. I'm not real sure whether
I don't know what
the big American papers. And then we heard that there were a few delegations that went down and talked to the Treasury folks, right?
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, boom. That's all they did. They didn't think of any other options. They didn't think about NAFTA. They didn't
even make an effort. Neither the banks nor the government of Canada made an effort to lobby Washington on this issue.
Or how about asking us?
With a little bit of lobbying money, they could have sent FATCA. They could have got FATCA repealed because
well, I think that Canada was in a unique position, and if one were to look at the videos of the witnesses before the House Finance Committee, I believe on May 13th.
Yep.
Professor Cofield's a Queen's Law professor, I think, was quoted as saying that Canada could have or still could do a much better job on this issue.
Well, and Scott Bryson was making that
That's
point.
right. Yeah,
so
that was a question
Cullen.
in response to.
So, they haven't even really
Cullen.
tried to protect Canadian citizens in this. They've just simply handed over.
The party line was, this is the Americans' law. In fact, Mr. Reddy said something really bizarre. He said, it's American law, we can't do anything about it. He said, the only thing we can do is to put a few checks, I forget the exact phrase, and then he said, and that's what FATCA does. And I thought, that makes absolutely no sense. FATCA is the way that the Canadians put checks and balances on the Americans.
Well,
there
was quite a number of things they could do.
It was just bizarre.
If the United States decided that it wanted to withhold 30% on transfer payments, Canada could have turned the lights off in 5 states.
Of course, on a very simplistic level, they could have just said, no, we're not going to participate in this.
Or we're not going to send the oil down to the United States, which keeps half the cars in the United States on the road. Okay, and how long do you think it would be before the United States citizens, the people living, the homelanders we call them, living in the United States, would be happy if they had no natural gas to heat their homes, if they had no electricity to turn the lights on, if they had no oil to run their cars. I mean, in other words, Canada has leverage. And how about a 30% withholding on Walmart, or Costco,
Yeah.
or any number of other assets that are essentially American assets in Canada? It's not like we don't have any leverage.
I was told by an MP, because I tweeted some of these guys, and I said, what about NAFTA? Because Professor Cofield has written a book on it, and he talks about there are provisions in NAFTA. What about the World Trade Organization? What about contacting some of the other governments? And the fellow said to me, you don't understand what it is. Why don't you educate yourself?
Who said that?
There was more than one conservative MP.
Oh my God! Actually, it's
Said
just
that
the
to
opposite.
me.
I am absolutely convinced, having watched this process unfold, that in fact the conservative MPs don't understand anything because they're not required to understand anything, and if they did, they probably wouldn't get their nomination papers signed by Mr. Harper. But it really is, I think, a problem of lack of understanding. I mean, one way of looking at FATCA is the attempt to enforce U.S. tax law in Canada, and part of the problem is that these people don't understand what that means. I mean, there are huge incompatibilities between Canadian and U.S. tax law.
Well, they don't even understand what the un-American citizen is.
Not only do they not understand what an American citizen is, but they seem perfectly content to allow that term, whatever it is, to be defined and redefined at will by the United States. I mean, my prediction is that within 10 years, all Canadians will be American. Why not?
Why not?
Then they'll move to residence-based taxation, but the rule will be that U.S. residents don't pay tax. Yes, that's exactly it. The U.S. will move to residence-based taxation once the rest of the world has been deemed to be U.S. citizens. And that will be the role of FATCA. Can you imagine?
Well, yeah, they're essentially doing that already, but
Well, they are doing that already.
They're doing it already with the U.S. dollar, because they can export their dollar to any country in the world, and every country in the world accepts it. Well, where does the U.S. dollar come from? From a printing press, okay?
Yeah,
so the United States is able to export its money. It's essentially a tax on the rest of the world.
Hasn't there been a deal between Russia and China where they're going to exchange not in the U.S. dollar?
Well, I mean, there are these bilateral, trilateral agreements.
It's beginning. I mean, what do you think that the U.S. dollar will continue to be the dominant reserve currency of the world?
Well, it's inevitable that it's going to fall. Inevitable.
Eventually.
And but nobody knows exactly when it will happen. But I think it will take a long time, and then it will happen instantaneously.
But
because today we're dealing with high-frequency trading. So the day when the dollar drops, it's going to happen very quickly, maybe in microseconds.
Why? Why would that be?
Because that's the way the high-frequency trading works.
Huh.
That's a good reason for Canada to begin to deleverage itself from the United States. Mm-hmm. A couple of months ago, we had the Honorable Sinclair Stevens on this show, and he had some interesting comments. He was talking about, he was asking the question, I mean, why doesn't Canada sort of strengthen the role of the Commonwealth, lead the Commonwealth, if you will? I mean, looking at the huge number of countries and the population involved, and how, Canada could in fact use its role as a NAFTA partner, in that regard. And I think that's a very interesting question as well. But, Peter, the point that you make that I think is applicable absolutely to everybody is that FATCA is absolutely, or rather the acceptance of FATCA by the Harper government is an absolute failure of democracy in Canada, a failure of any kind of representative government at all. And in a broader sense, I mean, what do you see as the solution to that?
The solution?
Do you think there is one?
Well, I mean, the only solution, the only solution that Canadians are going to accept is the political solution, is vote these guys out of office. And
hopefully we will. And in fact, that was what started that tweet thing. I told them, we will remember this. There's more than 1 million of us. If you think you're going to do this to us, watch us.
The real difficulty, though, at this point is that any to get a majority government, you don't even need half the votes in the country. I mean, you need, what, 35% of the votes in the country?
Well, 35% of the people who actually vote.
Who
actually
That's what
vote.
I mean.
But I mean,
and
you
that's
know,
what, at most, 50-60% of the people of the eligible voters.
60%. Well, and it's lower all the time. Trivia. This would be regarded as trivia by Canadians. Do you know that today, June 30th, there were 4 by-elections in Canada?
Yeah, I did.
You did know that.
I did.
Did you know that?
Yep.
Well, I didn't know. I didn't.
You
It's
did?
all
Not
over
in,
the
it wasn't in
Toronto.
my writing.
Yeah, it wasn't in your writing.
Not in my
but
backyard.
there are.
It's not in my
Oh,
writing.
okay. Another trivia question. Okay, so you know that there are 4. Do you know where they are?
Olivia Chow's writing.
Why? Oh, no. It was not Olivia
Oh, it's
Chow
in
writing. That reminds
Trinity
me of
Spadina.
who's that Massachusetts ex-Massachusetts Senator Brown? What's his name?
Scott
Brown. Absolutely. Yeah. That when you refer to it as Olivia Chow's writing, you know, I remember the CNN interview where, you know, it's a debate and Scott Brown is asked the question. Well, you know, how can you sit in Teddy Kennedy's seat and, you know, vote against, something to do with health care? And he said, this is not Teddy Kennedy's seat. This is not the Democrats' seat. This is the people's seat.
Ooh, nice.
It's not Olivia Chow's writing.
Sorry.
What are you talking
Sorry. I just meant it was that location. Sorry. And she's not a conservative, so I don't hate her guts.
Oh, there's no. I don't think you should hate it. I don't
Well,
think
I
you should
don't-
hate
you know, I'm
any
angry.
MPs
I'm
at
angry.
all. But no, that's misdirected because the whole point here is that the MPs, it's just not set up to represent constituents anymore. And this is what we're really finding. I mean, sure, you can say, well, you know, and by the way, I mean, my observation of the work of the Isaac Brock Society and people associated with it was that it was a massively phenomenal, amount of lobbying, and attempts to get people attention. I mean, I'd never seen anything like it.
Well, on a grassroots level, people just spontaneously writing their member of parliament.
But I mean, isn't that what democracy should be about?
Well, I would think so.
Well, that's what goaded us. The idea that that's the way it's supposed to work.
Yeah. So I mean, I think that
the proof is in the pudding. Not only did we lobby conservative MPs, but we also lobbied the opposition MPs.
Oh, and they really came on board.
And they actually came on board with us and agreed with us and began to
they did.
speak
Absolutely.
They
And
did. I mean, the
Elizabeth
work
May.
of
on the floor of Parliament.
Yeah, the work of Murray Rankin, Nathan Cullen, Elizabeth May. I mean, it was, I think it was phenomenal. Yeah, sure. I mean, I think it was phenomenal. I mean, having been a witness on those committees and watching that firsthand, I mean, I think that they really, really did Canada proud.
Well,
And when we did our protest in Ottawa, we stood out there in the cold, and there was a half dozen, maybe a dozen of us at most at one point, and the MPs came by and talked to us. But they weren't with the Tory party, the government. They were the opposition.
Murray Rankin gave a very moving explanation of what the amendment that the NDP, I think was number 6, that they were trying. I mean, he just really resonated with the idea that government should be for us. That sovereignty mattered, that if somebody was a Canadian, they were Canadian. I mean, it was really quite powerful. And Nathan Cullen also saying things like, it's so obvious. You've got this law and this law and this law, and you've just said, oh, this FATCA overrides the Privacy Act. It overrides...
But my point is, it is in fact so obvious that anyone who is a true Canadian patriot, who's got a high school education or even less, can figure this out. Mm-hmm. And yet, no matter how many letters we sent to MPs on the Conservative side, they did not respond.
Well, that's the problem, man.
So here's something
coming back to this point that these MPs, their allegiance is to the party. It is to the party. It is not to the people who elect them, and that's the problem
gain, though?
here.
What do they gain by allowing?
They get a pension.
That's it.
Well, there's
that's
that.
The idea.
That's sufficient.
And they may, in certain cases, for example, my father-in-law said that the MP in his writing said that he opposed Stephen Harper on something, and now he's a backbencher instead of a member of
a caucus?
Well, I mean, he was what do they call the cabinet here in Canada? I can't remember. He was a minister of something. Mm-hmm. Oh. And so he lost his position of power. So what do they gain? They gain a piece of the pie, a piece of the action in terms of the power that they wield in government.
Even the Senate said that they found this very difficult to stomach. After it had already been passed, and it goes to the
Tell me more about that. The Senate said what?
that it just, I don't recall it as well as I should. I was reading some of the transcript of after it had been sent from the House and they approved it, goes to the Senate and then to the Royal Assent, and some of the senators just said, this isn't right. I'm sorry, I don't recall it exactly, but it's there in the transcripts. You can read it.
Yeah, I've not read that, but I'm not surprised by that.
And everyone says the Senate is so useless.
Well, no. Actually, it is now because Prime Minister Harper has appointed, I believe, over 55 of the, in other words, a clear majority in the Senate as well. But in theory, the Senate can be very, very helpful. I actually ran a forum last fall on the issue of the Senate and invited Senator Percy Down to come down and speak from Prince Edward Island, and he was very impressive, talked about the role of the Senate, and left no doubt that even though he was, I think, once Chief of Staff for Prime Minister Chrétien, that he in fact did not see it in a partisan way, and that he took his role as senator very, very seriously.
How do you think Trudeau would react to all of this? I wasn't living here.
Do you mean Prime Minister Trudeau
Pierre
or
Trudeau.
his son? Well, we know how his son's reacted.
We
There was
don't-
no reaction.
No, but I'm thinking in terms of when I think of Canada, when I think of when I first came here, the thing that appealed to me was the kind of expression that Pierre Trudeau led to whatever he said about what Canada was.
Well, I guess here's my sense of how Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau would have responded. There's a great video of Trudeau in the early 70s. I think it may have been in conjunction with the War Measures Act, where
and he
said,
said, "Just watch
just
me."
watch me.
Oh, I love that.
What would have happened in the case of FATCA was that the United States would have simply deemed FATCA, deemed Canada to be FATCA compliant, rather than get into the discussion.
Get into his.
No, I mean very, very clearly, because I've always been fascinated by the Charter of Rights, and that, of course, was Prime Minister Trudeau's greatest political achievement.
Yeah.
But what I find most fascinating, that at this moment, I mean, we'll perhaps talk about the Charter Challenge a little bit in a second, but at this moment, Prime Minister Trudeau's Charter of Rights is being invoked to defend the sovereignty of Canada. Right, as opposed to just individual rights.
Mm-hmm.
So this, in a sense, I think the Charter of Rights was Prime Minister Trudeau's legacy, and I think it's unfortunate that the current leader of the Liberal Party perhaps doesn't see it quite that way. Perhaps.
Maybe he's too young to understand it.
Well,
you know what I mean? Like,
I don't know if anybody's too young. I think that when it comes to understanding something like the Charter of Rights, I think that the first question is, are there, do you believe there ought to be legal limitations on the power to what governments can do? And if you don't think that, or if you've never thought about it, or if you if you believe that governments are fundamentally benign and never do anything wrong, I think it's very, very difficult to understand the significance of a Charter of Rights. Clearly, the current government doesn't understand that.
But if you were an American from birth, and this is what's so ironic about this.
You mean a tax cheat by birth?
Yes, a tax cheat by birth. This is what we know so well. This is the way we were raised, to think that that equal rights mattered. And the push for this right now, of course, it's primarily, I guess, because it affects originally Americans, but how can someone not understand that? To me, that's inconceivable. I don't understand that.
Well, actually, I don't think that many Americans understand that either, even though they hear it, because if they really understood it, if they believed it, if they were sort of like a Ronald Reagan who believed that freedom was one generation away from extinction, that famous speech, they never would have tolerated things like the Patriot Act and all this stuff after 2000, after 9/11.
That's unbelievable. But if you grow up during civil rights and you grew up during Vietnam, come on, how can you not understand that? That's inconceivable to me. And maybe that's the reason, because Canada didn't have those sorts of things, you know.
You know,
I don't
one of
know.
the things that the one needs to remember about America is that the the Bill of Rights and this type of stuff, I mean, these were really Part 2 of the U.S. Constitution, right? And don't forget, Part 1 didn't have these kinds of things. You know, it was after the Civil War that things like the 14th Amendment
Right, okay.
came into being. But I mean, it really is fascinating, and it seems to me that, I mean, I understand that most people in Canada, 90% of people, are not directly impacted by something like FATCA.
Not yet.
Not yet. But I think what's important is that if the rights of one politically powerless group are trampled over, there can be no doubt that the rights of other groups can be trampled over, and that's why this should be of concern to all Canadians.
Well, I've already written at Isaac Brock in terms of other charter rights that are being violated. You take, for example, native rights. If a native person is born in the United States but is a resident of a Canadian
50% bloodline has to have 50%. It's not. It is not just you were born there.
No, but what I'm saying is, a Canadian. There are natives who are born in the United States who live in Canadian reserves.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, and some of them have even fought in Vietnam and other wars.
Mm-hmm.
But my point is that their banking account information can be given to the United States. Well, if they live on a reserve, they enjoy tax-free status on the reserve, and the Canadian government doesn't tax their income.
But
well, this
isn't
means
it a
that
completely separate jurisdiction? They don't have to respond to Canadian law, do they? On certain things, don't they have a certain?
The United States does not recognize Canadian Native Treaty rights.
None of them.
None of them. They don't even recognize their own treaties. So why would they recognize Canadian treaties?
Yeah, what a dumb question.
Okay, so if that person opens up a bank account, then that bank account information can be sent to the United States. And yet this person who is a native has the right to tax freedom status in the Canadian reserve if they live there.
It
now,
means different, yeah, it means a different
now they're not
payment,
paying any
so-
taxes in Canada at all.
So
So
they'll pay them to the United States.
they might have to pay all their taxes to the United States as a result.
Oh, it's really bizarre.
Oh, and then let's take the Francophone rights, which are in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. The United States laws are not written in French.
Yes,
so that's
I remember you're talking about this earlier. I thought that was a brilliant suggestion, if I might say, that that really the United States has an obligation to at the very least communicate with people in Quebec in French.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, at very least.
In fact,
And then they can take this to the rights. What is it? The Language Commission in Canada, and make a complaint there. If the United States, for example, sends a bill to a Quebecer or any Francophone in Canada in English, of course, because all their correspondence is in English. I don't even know if they do it in Spanish. I'm not sure.
Spanish.
Maybe
well,
Spanish.
don't forget. I mean, if they keep this stuff in English, I mean, there will be less compliance, more mistakes, and a greater penalty base, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's
but
to their advantage.
in any case, the bill has, at very least, the bill has to arrive in French. Otherwise, the Francophone has the right to take that to the Language Commissioner and say, "Look, you've allowed the Canada Post to bring me this. Canada Post is a Crown corporation. Crown Corporation can't discriminate against Francophones in Canada. This is one of the angles I looked at when I
make a new bill for that."
Well, it's very, very interesting because I'm not 100% sure of this. My memory is that the Charter of Rights does sort of constitutionalize English and French as equal languages.
Well, I mean, I don't see how the current government of Canada can pass a law which would systematically discriminate against Francophones, because it's imposing the law of an English-speaking country on Francophones.
Yeah,
Well, that's a
I
good
mean, I
point,
think
Peter.
you're absolutely right. I mean, I think that's an excellent point.
So that's another point. What do we say? At least 3 or 4 points of the Charter of Rights
You
and
know,
Freedoms.
FATCA doesn't seem to me to be a very good thing. Would you agree?
Well, it's a gift that keeps on giving to
Yes,
the people
the-
in the compliance
Absolutely.
industry.
The gift
right?
that
The
keeps,
gift that keeps right on giving.
Oh, you,
To
come on,
people
guys,
who
that's my
are
life.
filling out U.S. Tax forms and things like this.
The lawyers and
the
the
cross-border
accountants.
accountants. and
You're
lawyers.
lying. Okay.
I mean, this is the scandal to me. There's a place that does taxes called U.S. Tax Office, not a kilometer from my house, and it's scandalous to me that there is a place where they help you do your U.S. taxes right there in my neighborhood. I mean,
That really bugs
this is a foreign country we're talking about. It's
And a hostile one at that.
a
at this
hostile
point.
one too. I mean, the Chinese don't have a tax collection place
That's
near my
interesting.
house. The
That's
Russians
interesting.
don't have one. Why don't
Only
we
the
allow the
Americans.
Italians to come in and collect taxes in Canada,
What
or
about-
the
no,
the
what
Portuguese
about
or
this
the
business of
Koreans?
Eritrea? What about this business of Eritrea?
Oh yeah, they kicked out the
2%.
Eritrea.
Brouhaha again about complaining about, as I understand it, Eritrea is a nation in North Africa that
It's
is the
split
only
from-
other country in the world that wants to tax its citizens abroad.
2%.
They have only 2%. Yeah,
2%.
and that's why I would never compare the United States to Eritrea because given that the United States wants so much
Oh,
more than 2%,
but
it's almost
the-
unfair to Eritrea, isn't it?
It's very unfair. Their
the
tax form is 2
stink.
pages long.
Yeah, I mean,
I've literally seen the taxes from 1 year from some of the people at Isaac Brock, and we're talking
Oh.
about a stack of papers this high. Cost them thousands and thousands of dollars to get it prepared.
They want.
No, one lady who told me on the phone that her income for last year was $50,000, and her bill from her cross-border accountant lawyer was $4,000.
That's
So
outrageous.
That
So
is
just-
outrageous.
that's
it's
just
8% of what she
unbelievable.
made that year.
Well, here's the thing. I mean, I don't think anybody likes this idea of citizenship-based taxation, but leaving aside the sort of philosophical question, I mean, I think what is very, very clear is that one can have citizenship-based taxation on a more humane Eritrea type of level.
We would probably gladly
this
pay.
nonsense. Well,
Yeah.
I mean, nobody likes paying taxes. and-
No, but
but the truth of the matter is that at least in the case of Eritrea, you know what it is. It's easy to calculate. You don't. You might have to go to Business Depot and buy a calculator to figure your 2%. Okay, but the reality is that it is doable. I mean, the problem with Americans abroad is
scaring the daylight.
they have no idea what's required. They hear different things from different people. The only part of a U.S. form you can understand is the penalty provision.
Yeah, it's
okay?
very
I mean, the
clear
rest of it
there.
is
Let me see, $10,000.
starting at $10,000, and
And if you're wrong on anything, you risk
20%.
perjury and a
but
prison
you know what's
sentence.
fascinating to me? I mean, it's no secret that Americans abroad are either officially renouncing their citizenship or unofficially by just hiding their U.S.ness or whatever and going underground. But what I find fascinating, having talked to so many of them, is that the reason they're renouncing is because they want to comply with U.S. laws but have no idea how to do it. It's so complicated. So we've got a system where basically people want so desperately to, at least in a general sense, be in compliance with U.S. laws, but find it completely impossible to do so, and therefore renounce their citizenship so they don't violate the law.
And the effect of this is essentially these people are being denied the right to return to the United States.
Absolutely.
A lot of them.
Yeah.
Because they're scared to go to the United States. Because they know that if they stay in Canada or a lot of these other countries, they go ahead and renounce their citizenship, and they can get their certificate of loss of nationality, and they can show that to their bank to protect their banking information from the United States.
So in other words,
And
they
can
have to show they're not American to protect themselves.
and they can go into Swiss bank and open up an
Doesn't the
account.
U.S. take the position that the value of American citizenship is that they will protect Americans abroad?
Oh yeah, right.
Yeah, that's why they have
Yeah.
the right to tax you.
And so, but what we really have is a situation where people have to hide their American citizenship.
Well,
to
So
protect
they're
their
not
families.
No, but actually, the Supreme Court decided that it was
Oh,
okay
dear.
for the United States to assassinate citizens abroad, because they weren't protected by the Fifth Amendment of not being denied life, liberty, or property.
The pursuit of happiness?
No. This is life, liberty, or property cannot
Oh.
be denied by the government under the Fifth Amendment
Okay.
without due process of law. But the Supreme Court said recently, I think it was last week, that the government can assassinate U.S. citizens abroad because they're not on U.S. soil.
I like that.
That's really
So
good.
my contention is that the United States has no basis on which it can tax citizens abroad because not that it's not they're not providing protection because who protects us from the protector?
That's right. No,
Yeah.
absolutely. I mean,
Totally.
If the
no,
United
to
States
me-
can kill us, then why should we pay taxes
I mean,
to them?
I think
Yeah.
you put it that way, but I think you're still making it far too theoretical. I mean, no, seriously. I mean, I did an information session for Americans abroad in Switzerland, and I've never seen such terror in my life. I mean, they were afraid to attend the sessions. They were scared out of their minds. I mean, it's.
Did they ask questions and did they take part or did
Well,
they just listen?
Gradually, they began to, talk a little bit. I mean, muffled voices. They wanted to,
Wow.
but no, I mean, there's a real fear factor going on. I mean, I think probably less fear in Canada because there are so many. There are so many people. But just imagine, being a U.S. citizen in a country with not too many U.S. citizens, where the government has served notice, that they're going to start the FATCA hunt, right?
Well, and those guys are losing their mortgages. They're losing their bank accounts. That's
Oh,
something
my
we
God.
haven't. That's
Yeah,
something
that's
we
right.
haven't experienced.
Yeah, I
here.
mean, in Switzerland, they
And
can't
they're
get
even
bank
losing their
accounts.
jobs in some cases.
Yeah.
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 Absolutely unbelievable. I mean, I wonder if this isn't, we talk about expatriation, renouncing citizenship. I mean, I've begun to consider whether this isn't, how there's constructive dismissal in an employment context, right? I mean, I'm wondering if this isn't constructive expatriation. That people just simply, have to find a way to get out of this situation.
Well, that's what I felt like. That's why I did it.
You renounced because you felt you had to?
Absolutely. I wasn't going to let them come after us for what we had worked for, and we had an inheritance from my husband's parents and from my parents, and they had no right to that.
You don't regard yourself as U.S. property?
No, absolutely
Did
not.
you ever?
Never.
So if I were to ask the question, are you or have you ever been U.S. property? Your answer would be?
See, absolutely not.
I like that. Absolutely not. You've also, you relinquished. I know you say technically relinquished by becoming a Canadian citizen.
Yeah, I mean, I feel that I had to get out while the getting was good.
Mm-hmm.
So because the U.S. laws are becoming more and more restrictive, and also I'd heard about the HEROES Act, which essentially said that if you have over $2 million, then you're going to be a covered expatriate, and you have to pay an exit tax to the United States.
The
And,
HEROES Act.
So
Or was it the HARD Act? One of the two. The
It was
HEROES. But
HEROES,
there's,
yeah.
who was it that said these American laws? They have these apple pie names with a poison crust.
Oh, that was Allison
yeah,
Christians.
yeah,
The McGill Law
Yeah.
professor, right?
Yeah.
Apple
Well,
pie name and a poison crust.
In any case, I'm not worth $2 million, but I knew with the rate at which the United States dollar was going to be inflated that could be in 5 minutes. So
Yeah, and I think it's important, as we get to the end of this thing, I mean, this is extremely significant because once people reach the $2 million level, if they want to renounce, I mean, the United States is going to want a percentage of their assets.
But not only
basically.
that, but to get out clean, you have to
You have
file
to be
taxes for 5
compliant.
years.
Which means you have to visit the person who runs the tax shop by where you live.
Yeah,
that
exactly.
would be one person that could charge you $4,000 a year to do your taxes.
That's right, yeah.
But the problem is that many of these people have structured corporations. They have PFICs. They have all kinds of things that
Very
in their
scary,
portfolio
very scary
or in
business.
their business life that make it so that they would be absolutely ruined.
Yeah, that's right. I
If
mean,
they,
the basic.
if they went into compliance, so they
Yeah.
can't get out clean. They cannot renounce.
Yeah,
So
and
this
look
is-
what's going to
this is
happen with
the-
FATCA.
This is the sort of thing that I was talking about, that the Tory government, the government of Canada, refused to protect these people from the United States. Now, these are the people whose banking information will be given to the IRS.
Yeah,
So
and the
is gonna
reason
be ugly.
this is a problem, I mean, leaving aside all the specifics, I mean, under U.S., first of all U.S. citizens in Canada, are required to obey exactly the same laws as U.S. citizens in the United States. But the problem is that these U.S. laws punish two things. First is anything foreign, which would be the whole universe of Canadian retirement planning
everything.
things. And secondly, anything that involves deferral, which is, again, what Canadian retirement planning is about, and it ties into the corporations and things like that. So, I mean, it's a terrible situation because it's like all U.S. laws. I mean, you're in big trouble whether you comply or not.
Yeah.
I mean, that's basically the problem.
Yeah.
But I was reading you had a poem about FATCA.
Well, I didn't write the
You
poem.
didn't write it, but I thought it was kind of fun as we come to an end here tonight. And this, by the way, at least in Canada, is our last night.
Of freedom.
Our last night, right, of Canada as a
Right.
sovereign nation.
We are now
before
subject-
FATCA kicks in. But do you realize that I believe in Asia already? Right?
Oh, yeah, they're ahead of
right.
us.
I mean, Asia, I think, is already, let's see, it
There are
would
some of them
be
are
about 5 in the
15.
morning, I think, for example,
way
in Australia.
More than that. Way more.
Right? So a good part of the world is already under IRS jurisdiction.
Yeah.
So
They're
this-
running our banks soon. Tomorrow.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
this is the final night, and I hope Prime Minister Harper is sleeping well.
Uh-huh.
And Canada
Mr.
Day
Harper.
will have special significance to the United States this year because
They've now gained a whole new country.
exactly
Well,
territory.
when
not
Obama,
states.
Sorry, yeah.
Obama said he'd already visited 56 or 57 states, was it?
Oh, I
Oh,
see.
come on. He
Remember
doesn't
that?
even know how many there are.
Obama said that. I mean, just Google
Oh,
it.
that's too much.
I think he was referring to the provinces of Canada as well,
Uh-huh.
because he
Good
was
for
planning
him.
to annex Canada.
And I voted for him.
Well, but this
It's
has been a
just-
long history of American governments have been planning to annex
Yeah.
Canada. But sure,
Okay,
why don't you read
here's
this
the
to
poem.
us?
This was given by a young lady on the Isaac Brock who has a very good gift for making lyrics and poetry, and we thought of it like Christmas Eve because it's our last night.
This is FATCA Eve.
Yes, it's FATCA Eve. The night before FATCA. FATCA, the gift that just keeps on giving, which is not my line, but I
Here
love
we
that.
go with the poem.
Yeah, 'twas the night before FATCA when all through this land our lawmakers shrugged that they raised their hands to cede to the U.S. our sovereignty while dumping our charter rights into the sea. The victims of FATCA all shuddered with dread while visions of bankruptcy formed in their heads, yet Harper and MPs got set to parade for Canada's Day, but oh, what a charade. There are many who live here who won't jump for joy as new IRS agents get set to deploy. Banks will start searches for American-born as soon as the sun rises on July 1st morn. Those who get tagged will have their records dispersed from here to the U.S., but that's not the worst. There's all kinds of harm that some people can do when such sensitive data comes into their view.
Oh my God!
That's hilarious.
Think of so many problems in one piece of legislation.
Oh, it's going to be grand.
Which is why, as Trish has already mentioned, there is absolutely a legal challenge to the authority of the government of Canada to enter into the IGA to begin with, and the enabling legislation in particular. To learn more about that, you can go to stopfatca.ca, S-T-O-P-F-A-C-T-A, stopfatca.ca, and it's called the
Alliance for the Defense of Canadian Sovereignty, and I can't pronounce French very well, but the French is also part of our legal name.
It's an equal opportunity
Country, yes.
an equal opportunity challenge.
Yeah.
So, for those who are interested, I would encourage you to check that out. Once again, I'm sorry we didn't have Bauman with us here this evening, particularly that so much of this has had to do with the role of independent candidates. And I want to thank Trish Moon and Peter Dunn once again. You're always great guests. And actually, like you are the FATCA experts. There aren't many people
That's
who
weird.
know much more than you do about it. So thanks again, and this is your final night of sleep where Canada's a sovereign country. Good night.
Good night.
God. Oh.
you.